In the hushed breath of twilight, where the winds of time move like soft sighs over the crumbling minarets of forgotten cities, there lies a land once cloaked in starlight and quiet genius, Andalusia, a realm of delicate mosaics and almond trees, where fountains whispered beneath moonlight, and the air always held the distant song of a lute drifting through shaded courtyards. But hidden beneath the surface of this tranquil paradise was a mind of the heavens. The year is 1015, the Caliphate of Córdoba, once a beacon of intellect and light, begins to splinter beneath the weight of ambition and betrayal. And yet, while kings argue and generals draw lines in the dust, a different kind of conquest was being pursued, one that involved the movement of stars, the silence of the night sky, and the secrets of time itself. Far from the palatial halls of power, in a modest observatory tucked between citrus groves and olive fields, an elderly scholar named Yahya ibn Ismail traces the arcs of the constellations across a vellum map with trembling hands and eyes that still glitter with youthful wonder. He was not a nobleman, not a warrior, not even a renowned philosopher. He was a humble court scribe once, dismissed in old age, left to fade into obscurity. Yet he had built stone by stone a tower that watched the night, and from its narrow balcony he had spent the last 20 years measuring shadows, recording eclipses, and observing the silent ballet of the cosmos. But Yahya was not alone. Each evening, as the first stars unveiled themselves in the velvet sky, his granddaughter Layla would climb the winding stairs of the observatory with her lantern in hand. A girl of barely 16 summers, with ink-stained fingers, and a heart that beat to the rhythm of celestial clocks. To many, she was just a caretaker, a helper to an old man fading into sleep. But Layla had learned the language of the stars with the same fluency others learned their mother tongue. She could name every crater of the moon, trace every wandering planet across parchment, and recite the calculations of Al-Zakali and Ptolemy as though they were verses of poetry. Her grandfather had taught her everything, and she, in her quiet, determined way, had gone even further. Together, they formed an unlikely duo, an aging astronomer with memories older than most buildings in the city, and a girl who had yet to see the world beyond the olive orchards. But their minds lived in the infinite, among galaxies and shadows and solar predictions. And one night, as the heat of summer settled like warm silk upon the land, Layla saw something she could not explain. The star Alcade at the tip of the Big Dipper was not where it should be. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, checked again, and then, as the seconds passed like dripping water, she realized the star had shifted slightly. Not much, just enough to whisper a question into her thoughts. She said nothing to her grandfather that night, but inside, her world began to tilt. Could the fixed stars ... move? The next day, while Yahya rested in the shade, sipping pomegranate tea, Layla sat with her charts and tried to find a mistake. But the numbers did not lie. She checked the ancient tables of Hipparchus, cross-referenced the codices of Indian star catalogues, even consulted the Persian diagrams sent by traders. But the deviation was real, and so began a quiet journey. Not one of caravans or swords, or political revolutions, but one of mind and shadow and silence. Layla began to record the movements of stars nightly, every hour, every angle, every heartbeat of the firmament. What she discovered over the following months would have terrified the royal scholars had they known. The stars ... moved, slowly, invisibly, to the untrained eye. But over time, their positions shifted like ancient dancers moving ever so slightly out of formation. This phenomenon, now known as precession, had been touched upon by ancient Greek minds, but in Layla's hands it became something more, an awareness of the universe's breadth. But she dared not reveal it. Not yet, in the twilight world of Al-Andalus. Knowledge was a delicate thing, sharp enough to cut, dangerous enough to be feared. Instead, she kept her records hidden beneath loose floor tiles in the observatory. Each parchment rolled and tied with dyed silk thread, dated in her careful handwriting, sealed with a star she drew herself, always five-pointed, always facing north. Meanwhile, the world outside her tower began to unravel. Rival Tifus declared. Independence. Libraries, once illuminated by golden lamplight, fell silent. The bridges of Córdoba, that once echoed with philosophical debates, were now lined with guards and suspicions. And yet, in this growing storm, Layla and her grandfather continued to chart the skies, as though their devotion could slow the collapse of empires. Yahya grew weaker, his steps slower, his gaze more distant. Some nights he would forget which year it was, or call Layla by her mother's name. But he always remembered the stars. Always, and in his final months, he made her promise one thing. "When I am gone," he said one windless night, "take these records and hide them where no conqueror will think to look. This knowledge does not belong to kings. It belongs to the patient, the dreamers, and the children of the sky." She nodded. Tears glistened but did not fall. They both knew the end was near. When Yahya died, Layla did not cry. She climbed the tower, lit every lantern, and spent the night alone with the heavens, recording every shimmer and flicker like a prayer written in light. The next morning, before the sun had stretched its fingers across the orange groves, she rolled up all the star maps, sealed them, and slipped them behind the false bricks of the observatory wall. Then she descended, placed the key to the tower in her satchel, and walked away. No one saw her leave. No one knew her name, but the stars remembered, and deep within that forgotten observatory of Andalusia, hidden behind layers of dust and ivy, those maps still sleep, silent testimonies to a girl who watched the sky change, and understood what it meant to the world. She vanished, but to the universe she listened, and the stars still whisper her name. The scent of dust and myrrh drifted along the tiled corridors of Madinat al-Zahra as twilight seeped into the crevices of the city's colonnades. Hushed footsteps echoed beneath intricately carved arches, and water murmured in slender marble, channels that ran like veins through the palace courtyards. In this cradle of civilization, where knowledge had been cultivated with the tenderness of a vine, the astronomers of Córdoba turned their eyes once again to the heavens. Among them was young Sami ibn Tufal, an apprentice whose gaze held the fire of both reverence and rebellion. He had grown up watching his father, a respected scholar of the moon and its motions, chart silvered paths across vellum scrolls. Sami's earliest memories were not of play but of lunar eclipses and whispered arguments about refractions and retrogrades. His fingers had ink in their creases before he could write his own name. Yet while his elders found contentment in preserving ancient texts, Sami's curiosity burned toward the unseen. He longed not merely to observe the cosmos, but to challenge it. On a warm summer night, as the muezzin's call echoed faintly across, the valley and stars glittered like spilled salt upon black silk. Sami lingered on the observatory terrace long after his peers had packed away their instruments. The heavens above him stretched vast and merciless, a canvas scrawled with riddles. He adjusted the brass limbs of his father's astrolabe, recalibrating its angle not toward the moon or Mars, but toward a dim cluster few dared study: Alzubana, the claw stars of the constellation Scorpio, an area considered too unstable, too faint, too irrelevant by many of the elder astronomers. He had read whispers in dusty Syriac manuscripts, smuggled across ages, that hidden among those stars was a pattern, a signal, perhaps, ignored by Babylonian sages and glossed over by thinkers. Tonight he would dare. The polished brass of the astrolabe shimmered under the moon's pale light, casting shifting shadows against the white mosaic tiles. With every adjustment, he noted the times, the declinations, the aberrations, his calculations, spilled onto parchment in erratic lines, each symbol more frantic than the last dot behind him. A voice stirred the stillness. "You seek the voice in the claw," said a figure wrapped in the muted indigo robes of the palace library. Somi turned slowly. It was Layla bint Ravia, daughter of a renowned calligrapher and a scholar of ancient languages in her own right. She had spent years bent over scripts forgotten by centuries: Coptic, Aramaic, Punicand, though her presence in the palace was barely acknowledged by the elders. She knew things they had long chosen to forget. "You know of Alzaban?" Somi asked, brushing curls from his brow. "I know the myths," she said, "and the warnings. The Persians believed it a window, one not meant to be opened." Sami exhaled, equal parts delight and unease. "That is precisely why I study it." They spent the remainder of the night comparing notes, blending the mathematical with the mythic, and mapping legends onto longitudes. Layla revealed to Sami a fragment of a Berber poem scratched onto a slate once buried in the sands beyond Fez. It spoke of the crown of fire hidden in Scorpio's claw, and of a time when the world would tilt to the breath of a silent star. By dawn, the stars had receded into the blue hush of day, but something else had taken shape between them, an alliance, delicate yet dangerous. In the days that followed, they worked in secret. Layla translated, decoded, and uncovered linguistic patterns buried in centuries-old Arabic translations of Greek star charts. Sami, with hands steady from years of astronomical training, constructed new instrument squadrons that tilted at improbable angles, hollow spheres etched with forgotten glyphs, and mirrors polished so finely they could catch starlight. Like a basin holds water. It was on the 10th night of their clandestine collaboration that they noticed it. A faint, irregular pulsing within the cluster-timed, deliberate, rhythmic. Not a star dying, not a comet passing, but something else. A cadence, a signal. The thought chilled them. "It is not natural," Sami whispered. Layla nodded slowly. "Nor chaotic." They proposed it to the Council of Scholars the next day, stepping into the grand hall of Córdoba's House of Wisdom with scrolls, diagrams, and trembling hearts. The room was solemn and grand, with sandalwood beams and hanging lamps flickering above. Dozens of aging astronomers and mathematicians, wrapped in robes of saffron and sage, turned toward them as they approached the central dais. Sami's voice wavered only once as he explained their findings. He spoke of coordinates, of stellar cadence, and of a pattern hidden within Al-Zubana that defied chaos. Layla presented her interpretations, phrases drawn from disparate cultures that alluded to watchers in the heavens. 2 cycles of alignment that returned not in years, but in ages. A long silence followed. Then came the reply, "Master Farad." Ibn Malik, keeper of the grand lens and voice of the council, looked down from his seat carved with Kufic verses. "You bring poetry into astronomy," he said slowly, "and madness into science. The hall murmured. Some chuckled. Another elder, with eyes veiled in cloudy white, leaned forward. We are not priests reading omens, he said. We are stewards of precision, of harmony, not mystery. Sammy's fists clenched. Layla bowed low, voice clear and cold. If harmony fears what lies beyond its reach, then perhaps it is not harmony at all but cowardice. The chamber fell into a hush. They were dismissed, banished, in fact not from Córdoba, but from its scholarly circles. Their instruments were confiscated, Layla's parchments seized. Sammy's family warned that further defiance would bring shame, and so they vanished from the records of official history, but not from the stars. For beneath the olive trees, outside Córdoba, where the night air smelled of soil and song, Layla and Somi built a new observatory, rudimentary, hidden, and illuminated by oil lamps and fireflies. Here they continued their work. Here they tracked the pattern that pulsed from Alzabana, and here, one evening, they received the final proof that they were not mistaken. For just before dawn, a new star flared into being within the claw. It blazed violet and gold, brighter, then Venus, then dimmed to invisibility within moments. It left no trail, no residue, only certainty. Sami stared upward, trembling. Layla closed her eyes. We are not alone, she whispered. From that moment forward, their mission changed. They no longer sought recognition from councils or courts. They sought understanding from whatever intelligence had left its fingerprint upon the sky, and perhaps, in time, an answer. By the time the sun once again poured its warmth over the whitewashed rooftops of Córdoba, Ibn said was already awake, his fingers tracing slow patterns across the smooth rim of a brass astrolabe laid upon his work table. Outside, dew clung to the citrus leaves in the courtyard, and a dove cooed from the arched eaves above, heralding a new day, not with urgency, but with a tranquil insistence that the heavens were once again stirring to motion. The scholar's chamber smelled faintly of old paper and polished metal. Incense burned in a small dish beside an open window, its curling tendrils drifting out to mingle with the morning breeze. Beside the astrolabe lay a manuscript, partially unrolled, a delicate parchment copied from the Almagest of Ptolemy, in the neat, slanted hand of Ibn said. But he was not reading now. His eyes were lifted skyward, toward the last lingering stars, still visible in the paling firmament. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft enough to be mistaken for thought itself. The constellations are retreating, and yet they never truly leave us. Only the veil of light returns. The chamber door creaked open behind him. It was Tariq, the apprentice, his eyes still puffy with sleep, but bright with curiosity. He carried a tray figs, warm a dish of cheesond, set it down silently, careful not to disturb the arrangement of instruments. I saw Mars last night, Tariq offered after a respectful pause. Just above the garden wall, toward the east. It was burning like a coal in the dark. Ibn said, smiled, not turning away from the sky. You've a good eye, he replied. Mars is in retrograde. It tricks us, moving backward against the tapestry of stars. The old Greeks feared such movements, but we, his hand swept gently across the scrolls on the table. We map them, we measure them, we understand their rhythm. Tariq sat beside his teacher, his legs crossed, head tilted in quiet wonder. Will you write about it today? Ibn said, finally turned to face him, the light catching in the fine silver of his beard. Yes, but first, we must observe the morning's arc of the sun. There is a new quadrant I wish to test. One of my own making. Come. They moved through the mosaic-tiled halls of the house, past latticed windows that spilled diamond-shaped beams of sunlight onto the floor. In the courtyard, the old armillary sphere stood waiting, its rings still damp with dew. Beside it, a narrow wooden stand held the newly carved quadrant, its ivory surface etched with careful numerals. The scholar handed it to Tariq. Position it toward the rising sun. Mark the angle. Then we'll compare it with yesterday's measure. As Tariq obeyed, aligning the device with the discipline he had learned under many patient moons, Ibn said, stepped back and watched, not just the sun and the quadrant, but the boy himself, the way his hands moved with increasing certainty, how his eyes lingered on the horizon a moment longer than needed. The same fire that once consumed him now passed into another vessel. "Do you ever miss the old days, Master?" Tariq asked, lowering the quadrant with a satisfied nod. "I do," Ibn said, answered slowly, "but only in the way one misses. A melody once played, it still echoes, just not aloud." The two returned indoors where the scriptorium awaited. It was a sunlit room filled with shelves of scrolls and bound codices, each one a careful record of celestial knowledge. Among them sat older works, Latin translations of Greek texts, scrolls from Baghdad, diagrams from Damascus, all arranged like a library of stars. Orbiting the wisdom of the ancients, Ibn said, pulled a fresh page from a leather folio and began to write with a reed pen. His ink moved in graceful strokes, each symbol a bridge between observation and understanding. As he wrote, Tariq read aloud from the margin of an earlier text. "The heavens are a book, each planet a verse, each phase a line of poetry." The old man looked up, smiling. "That was my teacher's teacher. His words still ring true. Hours passed like quiet tides, the scratching of pens, the occasional chirp of a sparrow, and the rhythm of knowledge being passed from hand to hand filled the room. There were no clocks her only, the sky and the patient ticking of the universe above. But midday brought a visitor. A tall man in a travel-stained robe stood at the door, who'd lowered, revealing a face lined by desert winds. His name was Yusuf, of Fez, a scholar and messenger from the Maghreb. His arrival was unexpected, but his purpose soon made clear. He carried a leather case wrapped in silk, which he placed with reverence before Ibn said. This, Yusuf said, was recovered from the library of Toledo before the last fires. It bears the seal of the Caliph's astronomers. Inside was a folded parchment, yellowed but intact. When Ibn Said opened it, his breath caught. The chart within depicted a star not recorded in any of their current maps. A nova, perhaps transcribed from Chinese records and translated through Syriac intermediaries. Along the edges were annotations in Kufic script, unfamiliar and archaic. "This," he whispered, "this could rewrite our measurements of the celestial sphere." Tariq leaned in close, eyes wide. "Is it real?" Yusuf nodded. "It is. And there are others. I have been tasked with finding those who still remember how to read the sky." Ibn Said closed the parchment gently, as if tucking away a sacred relic. "Then we must begin again," he said. "From the stars we know, toward the stars we have forgotten." That night, under the indigo canopy of Andalusian twilight, the trio stood atop the courtyard roof. The air was soft, touched with orange blossom and distant music. The city below glimmered with oil lamps, a constellation mirroring the one above. Tariq adjusted the armillary sphere. Ibn Said held the parchment. Yusuf scribbled fresh notes by candlelight. Overhead, Mars still burned, bright and red, a reminder of ancient wanderings, and beside it, a faint, unfamiliar glimmer began to rise, a star, unmarked, yet not unknown. The past was returning to them, not as a shadow, but as a light. And so the night unfolded not into sleep, but into study, quiet, patient, steady, like the turning of the sky itself. Night in medieval Granada was a silken hush, broken only by the whisper of fountains and the rustle of cypress groves. Above the tiled rooftops and the fortress walls, the heavens gleamed with quiet splendor, each star a lantern in an ancient vault of memory. The air cooled with the fragrance of jasmine and cedar, and down winding stone alleys, the past stirred like a breeze through old manuscripts. In the quarter of the Albaycin, where whitewashed homes clung to steep slopes and courtyards flickered with oil lamps, a small observatory stood, its dome a solitary silhouette against the velvet sky, within its walls lit only by starlight and the soft glow of a hanging lantern. The astronomer Layla bint Qasim sat hunched over a wooden table. Her fingers moved in reverence across a parchment scrolling, faded but legible, detailing the elliptical theories of Ibn al-Shatir. She traced diagrams of planetary orbits with a steady stylus, whispering equations not as incantations but as gentle songs from a world that remembered its stars. She was not alone in this silent reverence for the heavens. Across Al-Andalus, in hidden corners and forgotten towers, a small brotherhood and sisterhood of scholars continued to stoke the embers of the Islamic Golden Age. They were remnants of a lineage that traced back to the libraries of Baghdad, the academies of Cairo, the observatories of Toledo, and though the great houses of learning had crumbled under time, invasion, and forgetting, the knowledge endured in fragments, in notebooks passed down in secret, and in minds that refused to let the stars be silenced. Layla's breath fogged the glass as she leaned toward the slit in the observatory's dome. A refracting lens, ground and polished by her own hand, caught the pale glint of Saturn rising in the east. She adjusted the astrolabe, its brass frame clicking softly like the ticking of an ancient clock. Every movement she made was deliberate, ritualistic. This was no mere study, it was communion. Her grandfather, Qasim the Elder, had been one of the last students of the Maraga tradition. It was from him that she inherited her instruments, her scrolls, her cautious faith in geometry. But it was her mother, a healer and herbalist, who taught her how to see, to look past what was known and lean gently into what could be. Where her grandfather saw angles and parallax, her mother saw rhythm and balance. Between the two, mind had become a map, not just of the heavens, but of the soul of Al-Andalus itself. Beyond the observatory, the Narrated palace stood like a sleeping beast, its walls humming with histories. In its halls, courtiers whispered of alliances and invasions, unaware that just a short walk away, a woman sat watching Saturn and quietly reimagining the sky. She picked up a small leather-bound codex and opened it. Each page bore the careful hand of centuries. Here were the observations of Al-Zarqali, the Taladan tables, refined by Andalusi minds who charted the paths of Venus and Mars before telescopes had names. She turned to a marginal note, penned in faded red ink. It was a correction made by a female student, long lost to time, who challenged a decimal point in a trigonometric function. Layla smiled at the note, not because of the correction itself, but because it was written with conviction. So much of history, she thought, is quiet, not erased with fire or violence, but gently misplaced by time. like a mislaid glove, or a melody half remembered. The names of women who mapped the heavens, of translators who dared to blend Greek with Arabic, of instrument makers who made brass. Single had been tucked into the folds of the past, not gone, just ... Waiting. Outside, the murmur of Granada softened as midnight approached. Traders had long packed their stores, the clatter of carts gave way to silence, and the towers of the Alhambra stood watch over the city like stone sentinels. Layla rose, her robe brushing the floor as she moved toward a case of instruments. She drew out a quadranter finely etched arc of silver and placed it beside the astrolabe. Tonight she would measure not only the inclination of Saturn, but the forgotten angles of a lineage that stretched back 1,000 years. From a small niche in the wall, she pulled out a scroll wrapped in faded silk. It bore the seal of an ancient order, the circle of the moon's shadow. This order, now known only to a dwindling few, had once operated from Córdoba, exchanging letters with scholars in Samarkand and Cairo. Their creed was simple: to know the heavens is to know the divine rhythms of existence. Layla unrolled the scroll and began to copy its contents into the margins of her own notes, in case time or fire came for it too. In her mind, the stars spoke like old friends. She didn't need myth to make them majestic. Knowing their orbits, their shifts, their burning fates, this was sacred enough. Knowledge itself, she believed, was a form of worship. And even as the world shifted, Christian kingdoms advancing, Arabic schools closing, books seized or forgotten, there were those like her who sat in small towers, listening, not resisting change, but preserving something gentler, older, more precise. A truth that couldn't be seen unless you looked up for a very long time and dared to ask, how does it move? Why does it return? What does it mean? The stars, of course, gave no answers, only light, and it was enough. Just before dawn, Layla closed her journal and exhaled. She stepped out onto the observatory's balcony, where the call to prayer floated faintly from a distant minaret, one of the last still permitted to sing in the open. She looked west, toward the dimming sky, and whispered a single word: remember. In the shaded quiet of the great library's eastern wing, where tapestries muffled the sound of footsteps and windows filtered the late morning sun into amber light, Yahya found himself turning the pages of a manuscript older than his grandfather's. Memories, the scent of softened leather and dust that clung to these ancient volumes was, to him, no different than perfume. Each breath drawn near the parchment was a breath inhaled from another century. He had grown so familiar with the curled ink of Maghribi calligraphy and the crescent flourish at the end of certain words that in his dreams they danced like constellations across his inner eye. But this morning was not like others. Today a visitor had come. She was not an astronomer, not yet. Her robes were sewn in the soft, even patterns of a calligrapher's apprentice. Her hands were stained with ink and pomegranate husk signs of someone more familiar with shaping letters than measuring stars. And yet she had stood at the threshold of the observatory garden and waited without speaking for an entire hour as the shadows shifted, patient as Moonrise. Her name was Amina, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried neither urgency nor flattery. She asked for Yahya, not as a scholar or sage, but as someone who had read his translations, his marginalia, to be precise, and believed there was something in them that no one else had noticed. You referenced Ibn al-Zarqali's missing quadrant, she said, her tone level, but her eyes unblinking. the one he never included in the Taladan tables. You wrote, he hid it in metaphor, in the verse of a travel poem. Yoya had almost forgotten that passage. It had been a note scribbled in exhaustion between star measurements, an idea born more of intuition than fact. Yet here she was, treating it as if it were a lantern held at the entrance of a cave. He motioned for her to follow. Together they descended into the basement vault of the library, where texts too fragile for handling rested in protective casings of polished glass and silk-laced cedar. Torches lined the passage like frozen suns, and the sound of their own breathing echoed between the tiled walls. At the very end of the corridor was a glass cylinder containing only a scroller, small one, crumbling at its edges, but sealed and preserved like a relic. It's a poem, Yahya explained, by Al-Zarqali himself, written under a pseudonym. It describes the journey of a falcon flying from Córdoba to Samarkand, but it is filled with astronomical codes. Amina didn't speak. She leaned in, reading the opening lines with care. When the falcon leaves the vineyard hills of the west, it follows the tail of the lion and the eye of the bull, until it drinks from the jug in the sky and rests where the twin stars sleep. She closed her eyes. These aren't just constellations, they're measurements, declination paths, sidereal points. Yoya nodded slowly. I've thought the same. But no one in the circle has agreed. Because they're not calligraphers, she whispered. She asked for ink and parchment. There, in the hush of the lower vaults, the two of them worked through the day, tracing the metaphor into maps, the poetry into parallax. And as the light from the torches flickered long shadows behind them, it was no longer clear who was the teacher and who the student. By the time the scroll's meaning revealed a hidden alignment, one that predated even the astrolabes known. Configurations they had forgotten: the hour, the dust, and the silence. Their calculations pointed not to the sky above Córdoba, but to a longitude further east. A library, perhaps, a ruin, a forgotten observatory that Al-Zarqali hinted at in code and verse, but never named. A place where he may have taken the final form of his Quadrant 1 that accounted not only for stars, but for time itself, bending celestial motion into mechanical rhythm. There's more buried in this city, Amina murmured, and perhaps beyond it. The days that followed were filled with movement. Yahya and Amina became a quiet presence among the others, watching, studying, returning at night to the vault. They no longer met only under sunlit windows, but beneath lamplit scrolls, comparing maps from Sicily, Judea, and Samarkand, aligning forgotten star paths with ancient merchant trails dot in the courtyard. The fig trees continued dropping fruit in silence, and the palace cat still lazed in sun-warmed corners. But something had changed in the wind. Word spread in whispers of Yar's long hours spent with a calligrapher's apprentice, of parchments unfurled across marble floors, of the return to Al-Zarqali's cryptic verses. The older scholars began to watch, though few spoke. Not because they doubted, but because something ancient stirred in the notion of two minds reaching beyond the dome of stars. One night, when the city had gone to sleep, and the last of the brass lanterns swayed, in the corridor breeze, Yahya unfolded a star chart from a Sufi library in Damascus. Amina had found it weeks earlier, misfiled among botanical studies. Etched in its border was a shaped circle, mechanical, precise, a quadrant, but one unlike any Yahya had seen. It carried inscriptions in Andalusi Arabic, Latin, and something older, perhaps Persian or Syrian. It was dated more than a century before Al-Zarqali's time. Could he have found this? Amina asked. Copied it, or was it his source? Yahya traced the edge of the design with his finger, slowly. Or was he trying to recreate it? There. Eyes met across the parchment, and in that breathless pause between theory and belief, a quiet certainty took root. That perhaps what had been lost in fire and empire, in the silencing of astronomers and the decay of stone, had not been wholly forgotten. It had simply waited patiently, like shadow behind starlight, for two minds willing to listen. The dome of Córdoba watched from above, ageless and still, and somewhere behind the veil of clouds, the stars moved, exact, eternal, and waiting to be named again. In the deepening amber of a late Andalusian afternoon, the sprawling city of Córdoba murmured beneath the weight of centuries. Orange trees stirred gently in the warm air, releasing their fragrance like offerings to time. Slender shadows stretched along the mosaic walkways, and the light softened to the color of parchment as the sun dipped behind the rooftops of whitewashed houses. Beneath the latticework of an arched courtyard framed in emerald ivy, a circle of scholars sat in silence around a brass armillary sphere. Al-Salim, now older, his beard a salt and pepper record of times passing, traced one careful finger along the ecliptic band. The scholars had become more than mathematicians or astronomers. They were interpreters of heaven's memory, architects of a cosmic inheritance that few beyond those walls even suspected existed. The House of the Dome, as the locals had come to call the observatory, was now a living organism. It inhaled the questions of young seekers and exhaled the celestial poetry of the stars. Roof tiles were constantly being replaced after storms, and scrolls were copied with vigilance to prevent the loss of knowledge. Lanterns burned long after curfew, casting halos of gold over the granite floors and reflecting off jars of ink and polished astrolabes. There was something sacred in this labor, not religious, but reverent, a form of worship not through faith, but through persistent wonder. A young girl named Amira sat beneath the vaulted dome, her knees pulled to her chest, her gaze fixed upward. She had only recently been allowed into the sanctuary of scholars, having spent years assisting in the preparation of charts and cleaning the long cases of instruments. Her mother, once a seamstress in the silk market, had died during a summer plague, and her father, a quiet man of letters, had brought her along on his frequent visits to the observatory. It was Al-Salim who first noticed how she paused before the sundials with tilted curiosity, and how she asked questions not to challenge but to understand. That evening, Amira held a scroll half unfurled on her lap. It was a fragment of a treatise by Al-Zarqali, one of the great masters of Andalusian astronomy. The script was fading, written in a hurried but elegant hand, discussing corrections to Ptolemy's model of the solar system. Beside her lay a wooden slate covered in chalk equations she had not yet solved, symbols surrounded by tiny drawings of stars and moons. Across the dome, Al-Salam observed her quietly. He remembered the first time he himself had traced a path across the stars with trembling fingers. Back then, the world was still wide with unanswered questions, and each equation carried the scent of discovery. He smiled, not with pride, but with recognition, the lineage of thought, as enduring as the stars themselves, had passed to another soul down in the central library, where cedar shelves bowed beneath the weight of knowledge. Abbas the scribe copied a new map of Mars. His fingers were stained with violet ink. Across the sheet, he added notations in Latin and Hebrew alongside Arabic, for the scholars of the dome had long moved beyond division. They believed language to be the most fragile vessel of truth, and so they used all of them, treating no tongue as superior. On the southern terrace, Farid adjusted a quadrant, aligning its edge with the horizon as the dusk thickened. He took his measurements slowly, whispering to himself the same chants his grandfather had taught him. Not superstitions, but mnemonics, rhythms of precision. His breath fogged briefly in the cooling air as he locked the reading into his wax tablet. Above all this, the heavens spun quietly. The moon rose like a pearl over the distant hills, and the constellations appeared, one by one, like actors returning to their marks in an eternal play. Al-Salim often said the stars did not shine, they remembered. They remembered their positions, their alignments, their whispered influences on crops and births and empires. If you listened long enough, he believed, you could hear the song of time written across them. Inside the dome, a gathering began, the kind that required no formal call. A soft bell rang, a signal that a celestial event was approaching. A comet, one they had been tracking for weeks, would become visible just after moonrise. There was a hush as scholars and assistants filed quietly onto the open-air deck, instruments in hand, robes drawn tight against the night air. Amira stood between Abbas and Farid, her breath quick with anticipation. The sky darkened into velvet. And then, like the slow lifting of a veil, the comet appeared, faint at first, then pulsing, trailing a plume of ghostly light. There were no cheers, no shouts, only silence. Each gaze turned upward was not seeking proof, but meaning. Al-Salim spoke in a voice barely louder than the breeze. Every path it traces has been traced before, but each time it appears new, because we are new. The heavens are mirrors. They do not change, we do. Afterward, the scholars returned to the inner chamber, where trays of dried dates and mint water awaited. A candlelit conversation unfolded, ranging from orbital mechanics to poetry. Al-Salim recited verses from Ibn Hazm, and Abbas countered, with Ovid all the while mapping new conjectures on papyrus margins. That night, Amira could not sleep. She wandered the dark halls, her feet silent on the stone, until she reached the roof. There, lying flat on her back, she traced the arc of the comet with her eyes, thinking not of mathematics, but of stories. Who else had seen this light across the centuries? What forgotten eyes, what unnamed minds, what unsung thinkers had stood where she now lay? The stars gave no answer, only a gentle silence, deep and old. And so the night wore on. Beneath that wheeling dome, knowledge was not merely preserved, it was cherished, shared in whispers, carried like fire from one hand to the next. And even as kingdoms rose and fell beyond the city's walls, and politics churned in the courtly chambers, the house of the dome remained, a heartbeat of wonder in a world of noise, where the heavens turned and the earth listened. The wind shifted gently through the cypress groves above Granada as twilight gathered on the edge of the Alhambra. A bluish veil descended slowly across the courtyards where fountains whispered like ancient voices in prayer. Along the pale marble arcade of the Palacio de los Leones, the stars had just begun to blink through the indigo ceiling of the sky chuan. To the scholars below, a reminder of distances measured not in miles, but in meaning. In a study cloistered, away from the watchful eyes of court and clergy alike. The last circle of the ILM Al-Nujemda, secret brotherhood of Andalusia, astronomers enfold maps, whose ink was barely dry. Over vellum stretched taut on polished cedarwood tables, they bent like monks at morning devotion, their ink-stained fingers gently tracing the newest star paths recorded from their rooftop observations. Beside them, globes etched with Arabic, constellations spun on brass pivots, whispering of worlds yet unnamed by Europe. Among them now stood a woman whose presence had become more than rumor, mathematician from Fez, known only by her pseudonym, Rayha. Her name, like the fragrance of night-blooming jasmine, was soft yet penetrating. With her arrival came new scrolls pages of trigonometric renderings and shadow length, formulas refined through desert sun and Saharan precision. She spoke little, but when she did, it was to point out where the stars bent more truly than the accepted chart suggested. Her mind, a cathedral of geometry, carried whispers of Hellenic texts translated by her father, lost in the silence of a burned library. In Tlemcen, the others listened not with patronizing curiosity, but with the respectful silence of men who recognized knowledge older than borders. Boo. Hofs unfolded a letter she had carried hidden in the inner fold of her robe. The script was careful, trembling slightly, as if written by an aged hand accustomed to calligraphy but weakened by time. To the brothers of the sky, if these charts match your own, then we have all witnessed the same truth from separate towers. Let that be proof that the firmament answers not to kings or sultans, but to the patient eye. Should Córdoba fall, or Fez be silenced, the stars will still remember us. Yusuf ibn Nusayr room fell into reverent stillness. Yusuf ibn Nusayr, once thought lost, vanished during the purges in Toledo, had survived, and more than that, he was still watching the sky. Rayhana set a bronze astrolabe onto the table, one unlike any the brothers had seen. It bore coordinates that didn't correspond to any known celestial latitude. At first, they puzzled, was it damaged, misaligned? But when they compared the stars to the values etched in its disk, something stirred in their memories. It was a projection, not for stars above, but for those beneath. This, she whispered, is a map for when the sky is underfoot, when one is sailing the great oceans. This astrolabe is made not for observatories, but for ships. The air thickened, scented with oil lamps in anticipation. The age of navigation was dawning on the western horizon, Portugal whispering to the Atlantic, Castile plotting new maps. And yet here, in the Muslim south, a tool lay ready that could have changed the course of empires long ago, if only it had been shared. Rayhana unrolled a second parchment, this one brittle with age, stained by salt. It depicted the movement of stars along the southern hemisphere, far beyond the reach of Iberia's known coastlines. "Where did you find this?" asked Ali Al-Katobi, his voice trembling. "From a wrecked dhow off the coast of Mogadishu," she replied. "Its captain was searching for a star they called Al-Sadar, the place where the sky swallows the sea." Gasps filled the room. The star was known only in legendly to mark the crossing of the equator by mariners long before compasses made such journeys safe. "It is not a myth," she said. "It is real, and so is the land beyond it. These maps are the legacy of an older astronomy, one born of the ocean rather than the desert. We have only ever watched half the sky." In the courtyard beyond the study, the murmurs of the palace guards began to fade. A change was coming, like the hush before a windstorm. Granada's court had grown uneasy. The Christian kingdoms of the north pressed closer every month. And yet here, in this chamber of arcane instruments and half-buried truths, another reality blossomed quietly, one in which knowledge could still illuminate rather than burn. Rayhana turned to them. "We have 3 months before the solstice. By then, the constellation of the Southern Crow will rise in the far southern sky. If we send a ship now, guided by this astrolabe, it may reach the parallel line where day and night become equal, and bring back proof that the heavens are deeper than we feared. They hesitated. For centuries, they had observed, calculated, recorded, but now a choice stood before them, not of scholarship, but of action. Ali al-Katobi stood, his knees stiff from long hours at the table. He looked out through the lattice window where the stars hung sharp and silver. "Then let it be us," he said softly. "Let the final astronomers of Al-Andalus become the first navigators of the forgotten sky." One by one, they nodded. In the weeks that followed, a ship was quietly commissioned under the cover of trade, its hull reinforced, its captain chosen not for loyalty to crown, but for his understanding of tides and stars. Scrolls were copied in secret, wrapped in oilskin and bound by cedar boxes. The Astrolabrehana's gift was stored in the captain's chest beside the Quran, and a worn treatise on optics by Ibn al-Hasham. On the night before departure, the astronomers met one last time in the courtyard beneath the Lion Fountain. No words were exchanged, only the passing of a flame from one candle to the next, until the entire ring of scholars held light in their hands. They did not speak of return. They did not speak of legacy. They looked only at the sky, the old stars, the rising ones, and the great unlit canvas yet to be charted. And in that hush of ancient stone and flickering flame, Al-Andalus exhaled once more. But this time it was not the sound of ending. It was the breath taken before the first step of a voyage into the unknown. Beneath the hush of velvet night, when the city of Córdoba seemed to drift between wakefulness and slumber, the observatory at the edge of the old caliph's palace gleamed like a beacon. It was not the stars alone that gave it light, but the lives, dreams, and intellects of those within. Ibrahim had grown older now, not in the stooped shape of age, but in the deeper, calmer manner of one who had watched generations of knowledge pass through his fingers like grains of desert sand, never truly lost, always remembered. His beard bore streaks of white now, and his hands bore the soft tremble of decades spent, turning parchment and grinding glass. But his mind remained keen, razor-sharp as the equatorial blades they used to carve the celestial spheres into diagrams. In these years, the observatory had expanded. What had once been a modest dome surrounded by a circle of stone had grown into an academic sanctuary. New scholars came from Damascus, from Baghdad, from even distant Delhi and Fez. They came not merely to see the stars through Andalusian lenses, but to learn how to think as Andalusians had learned, to wonder without fear, to question without shame, and to believe that the sky could be studied like scripture. The courtyard garden was filled with roses that bloomed all year, perfuming the scroll-lined corridors with a scent that softened every thought. Orange trees arched overhead, and fountains trickled endlessly, their rhythms matching the pace of poetic recitations and astronomical debates alike. Among the new students, there was a young woman named Layla. Her name meant night, and she carried the name well, for she was most alive when the moon crowned the sky. Layla was the daughter of a Grenadine mathematician, and though she had grown up beneath the archways of the Alhambra, it was the quiet gravity of Córdoba that pulled her in. Her arrival had stirred conversation at first. Women had studied in Andalusia before, none questioned their right, but few had risen with such urgency, such undeniable talent. Within a year, she had written a treatise on the elliptical nature of the planet Mars that caused even Ibrahim to pause in his nightly work and smile at the ink-stained brilliance before him. Each night, the observatory welcomed her presence like a necessary flame. She would sit beneath the great brass astrolabe, one leg folded, one stretched, her stylus dancing across parchment as her mind carved through heavenly puzzles. Her questions were relentless, and often answered not with truth, but with more complex questions still. One such night, as rain whispered softly on the tiled roof above, Layla turned to Ibrahim and asked, "Why do we insist the stars are silent, when they've guided every voice of humankind since fire was first lit?" He paused, not because he lacked an answer, but because the answer lay not in the stars, nor in the instruments that mapped them, but in her. "Because silence, my dear," he finally replied, "is the language of things so constant, so eternal, they need no words." She wrote it down. As Layla's name grew, so did her curiosity. She began deciphering older texts stored in the vaults, ones written not in Arabic, but Syriac and Greek, even fragments in Latin. She learned the forgotten notations of Ptolemy, the angular systems of Aryabhata, and the geometrical musings of ancient Alexandria. Her translations were not mere transcriptions. She breathed them to life, laying side by side what the East had always known and what the West had once forgotten. It was through these recovered fragments that she made a startling connection. Some diagrams long thought to be physically modeled using a new form of lensing. A convex crystal, when placed atop a certain aperture within the great observatory's roof, refracted stellar light in a way none had expected. The result, images of stars, appeared clearer, more precise, not blurred, but edged with color. This phenomenon, she proposed, was due to the Earth's atmosphere behaving like a second lens. Though others had suspected such effects, Layla was the first in Córdoba to demonstrate it using only instruments built by her own hands. For this alone, the scholars began calling her Layla Ulmarala of the Vision. With her discovery, the observatory's reputation surged. More students arrived. Word reached Cairo, even Constantinople. Though Córdoba was no longer the center of empire, it became once more the center of something far older and nobler, the pursuit of truth. But not all admired such purity. Beyond the polished stones of the courtyard, winds began to shift. Political undercurrents from the Christian kingdoms in the north stirred tensions in the south. Andalusia's golden twilight began to fade beneath the pressure of borders, alliances, and suspicion. Whispers crept like ivy across the walls of the observatory, rumors that it housed forbidden knowledge, that its scholars dabbled too much in the language of the stars and too little in the texts of religion. One morning, before the first call to prayer, Ibrahim stood on the highest balcony and watched the horizon. His hands gripped the marble balustrade not with fear, but with a growing sadness. He had seen kingdoms rise and fall. He had watched scholars come and go, scrolls burned and rebuilt again. But he feared now that the precious equilibrium they had maintained, the balance between faith and reason, silence and voice, was slipping. When Layla joined him, her face still softened with sleep, he said only, "If we must be forgotten, let it be because our words lived longer than our names." She understood, and so, with quiet urgency, a new project began: the duplication of every scroll, every diagram, every calculation in their archive. Students worked by lamplight and memory, copying line by line, hour after hour. Layla oversaw the preservation efforts while Ibrahim consulted a secret list of couriers, old friends from distant cities who could be trusted to carry their legacy. East, south, anywhere but here, the observatory became, once more, not a place of stars, but a sanctuary for memory. By the time the first decree arrived, demanding the observatory cease all secular activity and submit to the crown's scholars, They were already prepared. Ibrahim greeted the emissary with dignity. Behind him, scrolls were being quietly boxed and sealed. "We are but servants of the stars," he told the envoy, "and the stars belong to no kingdom." The envoy didn't understand. Most never did. That night, under a moonless sky, a caravan of donkeys laden with crates slipped through the side gate of the city and vanished into the plains. Beyond that, the observatory went dark for the first time in decades. Yet in cities far away, in Cairo, in Damascus, in distant Samarkand, new students would soon unroll parchment inked with Andalusian hands. They would see Layla's equations, Ibrahim's diagrams, star charts drawn beneath Spanish skies. And though they would not know the names of those who'd labored in Córdoba's twilight, they would know their thoughts, for thoughts, like starlight, travel far, and long after their source has faded, they still shine. When winter crept softly through the latticework of Córdoba, it carried no howling wind nor cruel frost, but a silken cold that wrapped the city in stillness. The orange trees stood bare in the courtyards, their leaves gathered like old secrets. Around the roots, stone fountains, once brimming with lively ripples and the laughter of scholars, now echoed only the slow drip of rain collecting in their bowls. Even the stars, cloaked by heavy clouds, withdrew into the firmament, as though in reverence of what was stirring below, in the tower of the crescent flame, now weathered with decades of breath and brilliance. Ibn Yusuf sat before a burning brazier, a thick woolen shawl drawn over his shoulders. His beard had turned silver, and his fingers, though still deft, trembled slightly when they held the inked reed. But the fire in his gaze had not dimmed. On the contrary, it had sharpened, deepened, and now burned with a quiet urgency. For though time had treated him gently, it had not waited. The manuscripts sprawled before him were inked with constellations whose names had not yet been spoken in the courts of Baghdad or the towers of Damascus. He had begun work on what he called the Kitab Oldia Ol-Nujem, the Book of the Celestial Circles, a labor of 30 years, drawn from thousands of observations, all made from his brass-lensed astrolabe and the polished mirrors of the courtyard. Observatory, it was not a work of pride, but of devotion. A lifetime's answer to the question, what rhythm does the cosmos sing, and why do we feel it in our bones? Outside the tower walls, Córdoba was changing. Where once scholars walked freely through the palace gardens, debating the orbits of Venus and Mercury beneath the moon, now soldiers patrolled with eyes that watched too closely the great library of Al-Hakam, where astronomers and poets alike, once pored over scrolls imported from Alexandria, had begun to close its doors, and whispers flowed like fog through the alleyways of stricter courts, suspicious magistrates, and the slow crumbling of tolerance. It was during this uneasy turning of seasons that a visitor arrived beneath the tower gates. She was wrapped in a travel-worn cloak, her boots dusty from the road. Her name was Layla bint Marwan, a student of mathematics from Madinat al-Zahra, though the gardens of that once luminous city had long since been reduced to rubble. She carried no letter of introduction, no seal of a learned house, only a worn copy of Ibn Yusuf's first treatise, the one that mapped the 7 wandering stars across the sky. She had read it in secret, copied it by candlelight, and followed the constellations until they led her here. Ibn Yusuf received her without ceremony. She bowed low, and he, with the gentle weariness of age, offered her tea and a place by the fire. That night, the tower echoed with talk of sidereal hours, of tidal parallax, of eclipses traced through silk charts inked with planetary red. Layla's mind was keen, her insights startling. By the second week, she corrected an error in Ibn Yusuf's lunar calculations that had stood for 12 years. He did not take offense. He laughed a deep, resonant sound that had not escaped his lips in months. "You remind me," he said one evening, "of the Andalusian sky. Not loud, not boastful, but immeasurably vast." She did not blush at the compliment. Instead, she posed a question. Why is it that the stars we study in silence are so often feared by those who shout from pulpits? To that, he had no immediate answer. Only silence, broken by the slow crackle of the brazier. Their collaboration unfolded like the unfolding of a nebulous low, radiant, and charged with unseen energy. Together, they redrew the armillary charts, noting new stellar aberrations and proposing a method of measuring the curvature of light over vast distances. Layla adapted a clockwork gear system from a merchant's timepiece, refining the accuracy of their measurements by a fraction most would never notice. But in astronomy, the smallest fraction can reveal the greatest truth. By spring, their manuscript had swollen to triple its length. The diagrams alone, rendered in inks of cobalt, gold, and soot, were masterpieces. And still they worked, for the sky offered no rest, only more mystery. But beyond the walls of the tower, the city's breath had grown shallow. One night, a candle merchant whispered to Ibn Yusuf's servant that the new emir was planning to purge the city of unholy sciences. The old tolerance that had once defined Al-Andalus, where Jews, Christians, and Muslims studied together under the same tiled roofs, was waning. Lost beneath the weight of fear, Ibn Yusuf sent Layla away that very night under the cloak of darkness, her satchel filled with rolled pages and wax-sealed scrolls. "Take them east," he instructed, "to Cairo or even farther. The stars will guide you better than any man." She protested, but he shook his head gently. "This tower has weathered much," he said, "but I fear even the stars cannot protect it from the dust of men." Layla disappeared into the Andalusian hills, vanishing like a comet beyond the horizon. Days later, the tower was searched. The guards, finding only an old man and a pile of ashes in the brazier, left unsatisfied. They did not notice the carved map on the underside of his desk, nor the mirror lens hidden beneath the bricks. Nor did they recognize the celestial patterns that adorned the walls not as decoration, but as cipher. Ibn Yusuf, though weary, returned to his studies with a strange peace. He knew that the work was no longer his alone. It lived now in the hands of one who understood both the stars above and the shadows below, and far to the east. In a coastal port of the Maghreb, a scholar named Layla unfurled a manuscript as the muezzin's call echoed across the waves. Behind her, a small group of students, Simony Berber, Persian, gathered with eager eyes. The book of the celestial circles was about to breathe again. The stars did not weep for Córdoba. They simply waited, as they always did, for someone to look up and remember. In the final hush of the Andalusian night, when the wind moved only in whispers and the stars blinked down like the gentle eyes of forgotten watchers, the last chapter of the scholar's quiet revolution unfolded not in thunderous proclamations, nor in scrolls carried by armies, but in the settled dust of ancient instruments, the breath of candle smoke, and the measured steps of students descending into history. It was in the year 1038, beneath the final glow of Al-Mutamid's court, that Idris ibn Khaldan stood for the last time on the high tower of the observatory. No longer the curious boy who once sketched star maps on palm parchment by moonlight. He had become the last steward of the wisdom gathered within those ivory-tiled walls. The inked pages he had copied by hand over the years now formed a collection vast enough to fill 6 rooms of the observatory library. Each book bore traces of the hands that shaped it. Pages once smoothed by Fatima's calm fingers, annotations in Yahya's deliberate script, margins laced with diagrams by Musa al-Rashid. He walked the hall of brass astrolabes one final time, running his fingertips along the chilled metal of instruments so precise they could still trace a planet's shadow. Across parchment, a soft layer of dust had begun to settle on some, yet their elegance remained untouched, like sleeping minds waiting to be stirred. The world outside had changed. Córdoba's brilliance had begun to dull under the weight of its own opulence, and political tides had shifted. New powers rose with less interest in the night sky, favoring fortresses over fountains, coins over contemplation. The observatory, once guarded by sultans and whispered of in other lands, now sat in silence, visited only by the occasional wandering thinker or owl who roosted in its quiet domes. And so, in these waning years, Idris gathered what he could. With a cart wrapped in thick canvas and carried by 2 sturdy mules, he began to move the manuscripts and instruments in secret. Night by night, down to the western foothills beyond the olive groves. There, in a limestone cavern warmed by earth and lit by oil lamps, he created a second home for the knowledge. It was not grand, but it was safe. Every evening he would read a passage aloud to the shadows on the wall, equations detailing the tilt of the earth, poems about lunar eclipses, or Fatima's serene reflections on time. The stars do not change, only our stories beneath them do. In his final years, Idris began a new kind of chart, not of the heavens, but of memory. He sketched the stories of each astronomer he had ever known, painting their portraits with quill and remembrance. He wrote of Salim, the boy who discovered sunspots by accident, of Khadija, who recalculated the solstice angles with nothing but sand and light, of quiet Fatima, whose soul seemed to orbit higher than the sun itself. When Idris passed, the villagers found him slumped peacefully near, his makeshift archive, a scroll half unrolled in his hand. His beard was silver, his hands calloused, and his eyes closed not in weariness, but in stillness, like someone listening for the final whisper of the stars. They buried him beneath the olive trees overlooking the cave, and above his grave they carved not a name, but a symbol, a single star encircled by a crescent, watched over by an open eye, a sigil used by the ancient Andalusian astronomers, meant not for fame, but for remembrance. Centuries passed, empires fell, stones crumbled, and yet the cave remained, hidden and untouched, its knowledge preserved by earth and silence. Eventually, in the 1800s, a young German scholar named Elias Kerner, lost during a botanical expedition, stumbled upon the cavern. He lit a lamp and saw the shelves of books, the brass tools laid on velvet cloth, and a map of the stars, labeled not in Latin, but in Arabic calligraphy, so fine it shimmered like silver. Kerner returned with others, historians, translators, astronomers, and the rediscovery shook the scholarly world. The cave was declared a monument, and its contents catalogued and displayed across Europe and the Middle East. A new observatory was built in Córdoba in honor of the forgotten minds, and children learned of Idris, Fatima, Yahya, and the golden age when Muslims charted the stars not to conquer the heavens, but to understand their place beneath them. To this day, on cloudless nights, the dome of the new Córdoba Observatory opens like a lotus, and if one listens closely through its echoing halls, it's said you can hear the scratch of pens on parchment, the low hum of thoughtful breath, and the faint laughter of students discovering the stars for the first time. And perhaps, above it all, the wind still carries Fatima's whispered words. Look up, for in the quiet spaces between stars, our names endure.